sometimes in certain environments, especially if you're really poor and you're in a very oppressed community and you have no opportunities, drugs can be a rational decision because it's like, here is a source of feeling okay when everybody else wants to stomp me down.
Welcome, this is the Dr. Junkie Show. I am addicted person, criminal, and PhD, Ben Boyce. Today I have a very special guest, my favorite addiction author, Maia Szalavitz. Maia's work has informed much of mine, and her perspective on addiction as a learning disorder may well become the updated model for addiction treatment in coming years. Fingers crossed. The current 12-step drug court shame-based model has got to change, and Maia's work can be a roadmap for making that happen. Maia's written many articles and books over the years, many of which you might recognize in a sort of, oh, I remember that way. She co-authored The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog in 2006, a book that takes the life course perspective on trauma to a whole new level. She's also co-authored a number of other texts, including Lost Boy, Born for Love, Why Empathy is Essential and Endangered, and Recovery Options, How You and Your Loved Ones Can Understand and Treat Alcohol and Other Drug Problems. In 2016, she published the book we'll be focusing on today, the book everyone listening should go borrow or buy, Unbroken Brain, a revolutionary new way of understanding addiction. She also has some pretty cool articles floating around on the internet, including a 2014 piece called Cheap Crack Pipes, Free Heroin, and Free Booze, The Evidence for Helping Addicts. And just like me, she was addicted to cocaine and heroin for a couple years before she began her writing career, and at one point she was arrested. As always, I'll link some of her work, along with resources related to our talking points, on the drjunkieshow.com blog for this episode. I think Maia and I could have talked for another hour or two. We have a ton in common, and her perspective is catching. So without further ado, here's Maia Szalavitz.
Yeah.
So before we jump in too far, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? What got you into this conversation? And maybe just a little overview of what's the book about?
Well, I had my own addiction. It started probably late in high school when I began experimenting with various things and then doing a lot of them. I eventually wound up addicted to cocaine and heroin and injecting many, many times a day. And I eventually got into recovery. So after that very brief and very bare level of story, I wondered what happened. I had been a straight A student. I had been gifted programs, all of this kind of thing. That wasn't supposed to be the image of somebody who is addicted to drugs and is shooting drugs. And I wanted to find out what was the deal, like how did that happen and why do we have these terrible stereotypes around addiction and how did people get better? So I just kind of became obsessed with the whole area. I've always been a sort of aspy kind of person. So I was reading when I was 3 and had obsessive interests and had difficulty socializing and all the sort of classic autism spectrum issues. But I was a girl and they didn't really have a spectrum diagnosis back then. So I was just weird. I eventually discovered that drugs were an obsessive interest that people also were interested in. And I just sort of went from there. It took me a very long time to figure out, like, how do you define addiction? What is it really? How do we best understand it? And the thing I kept coming back to was the idea that it was a learning or developmental disorder. The reason I kept coming back to that is because the best definition that we have of addiction is compulsive drug use that continues in the face of negative consequences. Basically, that's a problem with learning from punishment in relation to this particular area. And when I looked at other developmental disorders like autism spectrum disorders or pretty much anything in psychiatry turns out to be a developmental disorder, when you look at these disorders, what turns out to be a common thread is that they start at a particular time in life. They tend to be focused in a specific area, although there is sort of general intellectual disability, but most learning disorders are specific to one kind of area. Dyslexia has to do with reading and ADHD has to do with attention. And within all of those things, you can have spectacular other talents that are in fact linked to what also ends up getting you in trouble, but you have this particular issue. The other thing that really links addiction and learning, and it's kind of obvious thing if you think about it, but basically, if you don't come to understand that something does an amazing thing for you and it seems to like fix your life, and then you chase that thing. If you don't know what that thing is, you can't be addicted to it. And so this is why babies cannot actually be born addicted, because they don't know if their bad feeling has to do with hunger or pain or heroin or whatever. And they certainly can't go and compulsively pursue it despite negative consequences, because, babies can't really go anywhere. So that really stigmatizing way of looking at babies born with drug exposure really needs to go.
You just nailed one of the stories that's in this book, stigma and shame, and the way that it is not only established, but culturally reinforced, reshaped generation after generation. And right now, we're at the end of this era where crack babies were a thing. And people would say that with a straight face and ignore all the research. If you look at these children by the age of 12 is where most of it shows, you can't find any difference between them and other kids. What you do find is that sometimes kids that are born to parents that are addicted to drugs are born sick. They have some other struggles they're going to face. But the only reason we would say a baby is addicted to drugs is because it gives us a way to be angry at the parent. That's the story of the war on drugs over and over again. How can we blame the folks who are doing this perfectly natural thing, using a substance, especially when they get in trouble with it? And as you had said, this learning disorder model that you use that says when you do something, it feels good or it does what you want, you learn, there's where your learning is, to do it again. And when you do something that feels nasty, you learn, don't do it again. When you do something and it feels good, but then later it stops working, but you keep doing it anyway, you don't learn to not do it. There's this disorder. The only way that you can let that go right over your head is if we already live in a system where addiction is bad, it's a sin, and the stigma surrounding it.
The very definition of addiction, compulsive use despite negative consequences, in other words, compulsive use despite punishment. If punishment worked to stop addiction, the condition would not, by definition, exist. So we use the one thing we know will not work.
We have countries around the world that are having tremendous success with harm reduction models, and we're in the United States deliberately not looking at it. We're doing everything we can to ignore that, even as we make these slow strides. The only reason, it's not because we're monsters and we like to watch people die. It's not because we're really tricked into thinking that when Granny's taking her Vicodin every day for her hip, that she's actually some sort of monster addict that's going to steal stuff from us and her morals are gone. It's because it's become the norm. It's the status quo. It supports the system of superheroes, our police officers.
Yeah, I think, though, there's another important piece to that, which is racism.
Yeah.
Once we start seeing addiction as a white problem, the desire to punish reduces dramatically.
Yeah.
And when you look at the entire drug war and you look at how particular things became illegal, it's always in the context of racism or anti-immigrant panics. And when you look at our stereotypes of addiction, they are virtually identical to negative racial stereotypes. And if you look at the people we actually lock up, it's disproportionately Black and brown people. So the key reason for the persistence of this has been that it has been so useful to politicians to sort of signal racism by just saying, we're going to crack down on drugs. And then the racists can hear, aha, we're going to crack down on Black people. The whole apparatus of the drug war, it makes no sense if you think about it as drug policy, but it makes a lot of sense, as Michelle Alexander has shown in The New Jim Crow, that if you understand this as a policy to oppress certain groups, it works really well.
Prosecutors have, to some degree, some of them, have gotten hip to these social justice warriors that are marching around saying, look at the numbers, they don't lie. And their response isn't to incarcerate less Black folks. It's to try to incarcerate every white woman is like the epitome of, look, we can check multiple boxes, as if that's the solution. And I often think about this, that once the apparatus is built, it rakes in everybody equally. It goes across the board, and you can get arrested if you're rich. You can get arrested if you're poor, white, Black, Christian, Islam, atheist. The difference is, once you're in the gears of that machine, if you got a whole bunch of cash to throw at lubing it up, you can find different ways out. If you have, what I had is class privilege. I have 8 felonies, and it took me 6.5 really, like the 7th and 8th ones are the ones that finally got me in prison. And even that sentence was the first time I went and saw the parole board. How are you, ladies and gentlemen, doing today, right? Without even having a college education, I grew up seeped in my class. It's just sort of leaked through, and they saw white skin on the heels of 5 men of color that had come in for parole that day. And they saw me saying, if you release me, I have a place to go stay. They built this on racism from the guts, from the roots. Harry Anslinger back 100 years ago. It's still incredibly racist, and a lot of politicians lean right into that racism. But for people that are like, well, I'm not racist and I wouldn't put up with that, I'm a politician and I support it and I'm not racist, even if you think you're not, or that you're not endorsing racism, the machine's built to a point now where we still have a place for you. We'll hire the most woke cop in the world and put them on a narco unit if they're following the rules we want. I looked at the numbers. They just updated them again yesterday on the CDC, and they went to 81,000 between June of 2019 and June of 2020 overdose deaths in the country.
Yeah. We have this system that is established, wants to believe it's doing the right thing, and just wants to expand its power and wants to continue getting paid. And yeah, it becomes very much self-replicating. An enormous change that has happened, however, is that once people of color started to realize that you could be anti-drug war but not pro-drug, then you start to see real change, because politicians had always been across race supporting it. Yeah. And now that is no longer the case.
Power comes up a lot. I teach about prison, and that's basically teaching about power. The epitome of power is you're squashed into a cell and cut off from the outside world. But it's always reshaping. Every time you start to put your thumb on it and be like, wait a sec, I think I figured this white supremacy thing out, you better believe it's going to just squirt out from underneath and redirect itself, and the rhetoric's going to change just enough to buy them 10 years to repackage the same thing. And that's what I see with the war on drugs. That's not how you fix the system. You fix the system by beginning to rethink what addiction looks like and why on earth you would punish a condition that is identifiable only. I mean, the one thing you could really put your thumb on all addiction, they present in all sorts of different ways. The one thing that's common is that punishment never works.
Yeah, it biologically makes sense that addiction works the way it does, because we need, as humans, to be able to persist despite negative consequences in things like having kids or having relationships or having a career. So when that system is appropriately directed, you just persist despite the rejection and you keep going, and then you are able to do better, hopefully. But with addiction, it gets misdirected towards a drug. Yeah. And so we get all of that intense energy and passion devoted to this single thing.
You take this genealogical perspective that goes back even far. I wrote my dissertation for my PhD on the war on drugs, and I started about 1880 in San Francisco. And you did this as well, but in your book, you wound the clock back another 2,000-3,000 years and went to the roots of some of the oldest texts on the planet, the Bible, and made comparisons to how even in the Bible, it's always been considered a sin. But you do the same thing with evolutionary theory, this idea of reaching all the way back to the roots. And once or twice a year, I read a book that breaks my heart again, that we have deliberately skimmed out important lessons from our youth teaching, from high schools, from elementary, usually based on fear of religious folks showing up and saying, how dare you? But this idea of evolutionary perspective is so valuable. Sensitization and tolerance are two annoying things that anyone who's been addicted to anything has to deal with, and we hate it. I don't want to have to take 2 Vicodin tomorrow and then 3 the next day for the same buzz, but get the constipation and the itchy nose and all that other stuff after half a Vicodin. I get sensitized to the negative and I get tolerant to the stuff I really want. Why does this happen?
And this again goes back to learning. In order to learn, you need to have novelty. And that means you have to get tolerant to the new thing that you like. Sensitization is the reverse of that. And it's also necessary for learning, because you really kind of need to learn on a single trial. If you say you're a mouse and you see a cat, if you don't learn to run immediately, you are going to not be a mouse anymore. These processes are really fundamental to how the brain works. And they play out in everything from relationships to drugs to homework. Some people call it the hedonic treadmill. Understanding how that works and how a pattern of doing everything regularly the same all the time produces tolerance. Whereas if you have sort of this irregular pattern, which is not predictable, you can get sensitization. But unfortunately, you never get sensitization to the good stuff, because otherwise that would not be an evolutionarily successful creature.
Right.
Of course, opioids and cocaine are very different. Opioids are more prone to tolerance, and cocaine is more prone to sensitization because of the dopamine stuff. But the thing about that that's interesting is that opioids are inherently way more satiating than stimulants. So you can have that sort of afterglow kind of feeling with opioids, but whereas the pleasure of cocaine is the pleasure of the hunt and the pleasure of, I'm going to get this, I want this, it's cool, I'm powerful, blah, blah. Whereas the pleasure of the feast is, I've got it, it's all good, I'm relaxed. You will have more of the horrible sensitization effects with cocaine than you do with opioids.
My listeners just heard two phrases that they're like, pleasure, the hunt, and feast. Drugs and regular activity are not all that separate. And I want to bring the sensitization and tolerance point home. I don't know if you made this point in your book. I'm guessing you did because I couldn't have come up with it myself. But that as kids that have to live with your parents, you become really tolerant of even the annoying stuff they do, of the dinners that they make that you're just like, oh, because your life depends on you recognizing a safe, caring thing, your parent who's going to take care of you, and becoming more and more tolerant to being around them, even when they might annoy the crap out of you. Something magic happens around 17, 18, 19 years old, and we pruned a lot of the connections in our brain to pleasure, and suddenly the things that building a Lego tower that used to make me on top of the world is not working. And suddenly, my parents, I'm becoming very sensitized to first thing in the morning before I'm even up, I hear them slam the cupboard in the way my dad always slams the cupboard or whatever it is. These natural processes that have nothing to do with drugs, they are no different than what plays out when you actually add a chemical to the mix. Sensitization and tolerance are easy to understand if you can grab a hold of what they mean in your life and where you've seen them play out.
Yeah, the adolescent thing is really interesting because that coincides with a drop in dopamine.
Yeah.
So basically it means that you have to seek even more novelty to get the pleasure that you used to get from the comfort and safety of
This is so scary for parents if they're listening right now, but effectively what you're saying is it's entirely natural for adolescents to make incredibly awful decisions based on reward risk analysis. We have this road that I think every high school has somewhere nearby that every year or two, like clockwork, a kid is going too fast down the road. And I was the kid. We used to go out after school and talk somebody into buying us a fifth of booze, and we would go drive a car up and down the hilliest road, and stupid. Right? And we actually knew that people that had died on that same road. Something in me was like, well, the Legos aren't working. And now I'm kind of depressed because I feel like I'm 18 and things, or 16 or 17, things should be getting better, but they're getting worse. The damn Legos don't work. I know what I can do. I got a license and my parents gave me the keys. And you begin to hatch these schemes that if you back up 20 years later and weigh the benefits and the cost, I mean, it's really easy to see that you made the wrong decision, but for some reason at the time that happens. And dopamine's a big part of it, which I definitely want to talk about as well, how off we are on what we think about dopamine and how it works. So maybe that's a good entrance into that. Can you talk a little bit about how dopamine works and specifically as we go from 9 to 19?
Sure. So basically, dopamine is a very complicated neurotransmitter that does a number of different things. But we have this idea that dopamine equals pleasure, and that is not accurate. Dopamine equals desire, and sometimes desire is pleasurable. Desire is pleasurable if it's about to be satisfied. Desire is not pleasurable if it just escalates infinitely, which is what happens to you when you become addicted to cocaine. Or if you're extremely sexually frustrated, I guess. The thing to know there, and this goes back to the pleasures of the hunt, dopamine is all about the pleasures of the hunt. It's like, I am a big hunter, I can get this, and I'm chasing this thing. You're like a cat, and you're after the prey, and it's all cool because you're going to eventually get it. It's so cool that you can play with the thing a little bit, which is horrible that cats do. But anyway, that is the pleasure of the hunt. Now, the pleasure of the feast is after you get the thing, after you get that delicious meal or have that great sex or whatever it is. That is you're comfortable, you're satiated, all is good, you're loved, you're warm, you're safe. And that is mediated in the brain, not by dopamine, but by opioids.
Yeah, natural opioids.
Yes, exactly. And so that's an important thing to know. Your brain has all of these chemicals in there naturally, but it is very stingy about them because you need to get out of the nest. You need to not be comfortable with the Legos anymore. You need to go out and find friends and find a boyfriend or girlfriend or whatever is what you want. You need to go and do that to become an adult. This is how evolution gets us out of the home, because otherwise it's pretty comfortable. Why would you ever go anywhere? We need to have that stimulus there, but it also does come with these risk-taking behaviors. And I think it's kind of important to know that teenage risk-taking behavior isn't always stupid. It can certainly be plenty stupid, but a lot of great discoveries sort of end up with people messing around with dangerous stuff that they shouldn't. And young people are more likely to do that.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not recommending this, but what I'm saying is that for a lot of the characteristics that we demonize and think are terrible, there are upsides to them which we need to know about, because let's say you did stamp out the sort of curious, impulsive explorer type. Those people are certainly more prone to addiction than everybody else. Let's say we genetically eliminate that. Well, we'd have a really boring world. When we may miss important scientific and geographic-based kind of discoveries. The thing that we have to do for our teenagers is realize that their brains aren't fully baked, recognize that they have this tendency, and just keep them alive and as safe as possible through this difficult transition.
So we need a Maia Szalavitz's hilly, curvy road area. It's got to be about 40 acres. We'll give them old beater Honda Accords and make them wear helmets. And there's a lot of class involved. There's a lot of wealth involved, even in this conversation, because clearly everybody can't afford to go buy their kids' cars to crash. But there are outlets. If you really recognize, this is something else you do a good job of in your book, when you talk about solutions, when you recognize the specific thing that is, or things that are driving somebody's addictive behavior, whether it's impulsiveness, whether it's a sensitivity to anxiety, you can identify coping tools that are directed not at the drugs like we always do, but rather at the thing that you're using the drugs to get over or to make a little bit better.
Yeah, this is why it's really important to know the vast majority of people who try drugs don't get addicted. It's only about 10 to 20%, even with drugs like heroin or cocaine. What is different about the group that becomes addicted is they tend to have outlying temperaments, which could be anything from bold and impulsive and very risk-taking to extremely quiet, anxious, and introverted. There is not a single addictive personality, but there are multiple outlying things that will put you at higher risk. So kids with outlying temperaments, that mean that they're a little weird and they don't fit in for whatever reason. These outlying temperaments are often predispositions to things like depression or anxiety or ADHD or whatever. They tend to become those actual disorders when coupled with extreme stress, such as childhood trauma of various types, whether it's abuse or losing a parent or bullying or any of these many things. And then you put on top of that that people genetically are born with varying sensitivities to various things. So basically, most people with addiction have either this kind of predisposition, this kind of trauma, often more trauma than people who are not prone to addiction. And then there's a third factor, which I sort of call hopelessness. Sometimes in certain environments, especially like if you're really poor and you're in a very oppressed community and you have no opportunities, drugs can be a rational decision because it's like, here is a source of feeling okay when everybody else wants to stomp me down. You will rarely find someone with addiction that does not have one of these three, and often they have all three. Addiction is an attempt to solve a problem, and it's going to be a different problem for different people. So this is why our current treatment system is so bad, because we just try to one size fits all and just put everybody into whatever we have there already. Instead of saying, okay, well, here's somebody who they're missing in education. They're really smart, but for some reason, they dropped out of school or they got thrown out for smoking pot or whatever it is. And now they have no job, or they're at a job that's like really unchallenging, and drugs give them that thing that they're missing. So this person needs to go back to school more than anything else. Now, they may also have depression or whatever, but you need to come up with ways to solve the problem before, or at least immediately after, you take away the solution. Because if you don't do that, people are not going to stay in recovery. A lot of people need to start to learn their new coping skills before they even give up the drugs. And that's where the harm reduction path to recovery is.
Yeah. When you start to think about this differently and, again, erase this barrier that we have that's completely fabricated, that is between natural substances, behaviors, even like gambling or addictions to sex, and the chemicals. And we just talked briefly through this idea of the pleasure of the hunt and the pleasure of the feast. And you hear these terms and you're thinking, that sounds like 10,000-year-old terms, right? You're hunting? Yeah. And that's exactly it. We're talking about an evolutionary perspective. The reason kids act like that isn't because they were designed by somebody that was like, I want kids to be assholes when they're 17. It's because kids that acted like that 10,000 or 50,000 years ago were more likely to have kids because they were running away from their parents. And one of the things they were doing was having sex. And when you have sex, you have kids. If you're staying at home with your parents and not feeling the urge to get out, you're not going to beat the other person to genetic reproduction. And the same thing with hunt or the feast. I think those terms, they can make us feel like, oh, well, here we go. We're talking about theoretical things. No, not at all. You can apply this to your own life. And if you want to understand the feeling of cocaine, which mimics the thrill of the hunt, you can think of things in your life like promotions, and you do this in the book as well. If you are somebody that goes to work and you find yourself driven to a promotion, or you're trying to get a raise, or you're trying to get some extra days of vacation, or you want to be employee of the month, you are somebody that's driven by the thrill of the hunt. As weird as it might sound to people that are like, wait, I thought dopamine was when I felt good. Being comfortable and feeling like, that's not dopamine. Calmness, feeling like everything's just fine. That's not dopamine. Sweets.
Well, and there is a little complication with sweets, which is that they do tend to not be so satiating. I mean, sweet plus fat, then you get the satiation, but just sweet, you may just want more and more and more, kind of like potato chips, where again, that has fat. And I think the food companies sort of engineer this even more, but there are certain things that do that thing where they satiate you for a little bit and then the desire comes in. So it's always kind of this like complex cycle. And it has to be that way because otherwise we would just sit here.
This is a 300-page book, and it could be 6. So we're trying to weave together some of the threads of it. But you do the same thing with the thrill of the hunt, and actually took me back in time. I was a mainline injector of cocaine and never really had the language to express what was going on in my body when the bleach hit my tongue, and then the roller coaster underwater, woo, and you can just feel your heart beating, and you're like, woo, this is great. But then the next time it's shorter, and eventually you find yourself in this compulsive shooting up over and over. And I wouldn't get there. With cocaine, you describe the same process. Whereas with heroin, I always seem to get satiated. And you totally made sense when you say, imagine a hunt that you never get to the end of. And you start to realize really early into the hunt that that carrot is literally on a stick right in front of you. And you can chase that fucking carrot all day. You are not going to catch it. This sucks. It's like having sex for 6 hours straight and knowing that there's no end in sight. You're just wearing yourself out.
No, and I mean, it's interesting because, you know, when you sort of have this argument about what is the most addictive drug, a lot of people will say cocaine because of that intense craving. But the thing about cocaine that's different is that once you realize that, fully realize that that chase is never going to end, you can move past it. I certainly occasionally have cravings for opioids. I never have cravings for cocaine at this point.
Weird, right? Weird. I don't either. And it's the strangest thing because at the time in the middle of my addiction, I would have guessed that 10 years down the road, I would have a much bigger urge for cocaine. But you know what? That makes sense. I was usually on the hunt when I was thinking to myself, how are you going to feel in 10 years? Of course, I'm still going to want to hunt. And there's another really good description that you use to get around this idea of the thrill of the hunt and how dopamine shows up while you're hunting. It actually peaks before the kill, for lack of a better term. I think about books that I really want to read. And when I get up in the morning, and I used to have assignments for my PhD that I was like, I do not want to read another Foucault chapter. It sucks. I'd get up an hour late. I'd open it up. I'd get a page in and I'd forget half the page. But when I want to read something, something happens. And it is awesome. I'll be 10 pages in and I'm like scribbling in the margins. And that's dopamine. That's this thrill of the hunt. I smoke weed every day, and so I take drugs. But if I wasn't taking drugs, the same thing would still be happening. It doesn't require that you're on something. It's a way to think about it especially if you're somebody that doesn't use.
This is important, too, because what you're describing is a pattern that is quite common in ADHD, where basically if you have the dopamine, you can focus and you can do enormous achievements. But if it's math and you hate math, you just won't remember it. You will just sit there and it won't go into your head. And the teachers will think you're willfully not applying yourself. But your brain, without the dopamine, literally cannot. These kids, until they get to a phase where they can be doing the stuff that they're into and not have to do so much stuff that they're not into. And it's just terrible for them really early in school because they often just become so, disheartened because they think they're bad because that's the way the brain works. And understanding that we're all wired somewhat differently. Some people, especially if you're sort of more of an ADHD type, a stimulant thing may be the thing you crave. And I think cocaine is kind of unique in that it's so short acting. It may be slightly different from methamphetamine because it is much longer, but it's just kind of a way of understanding why you behave the way you do.
Yeah, this is something else that really struck me is, this aha moment. I would have been diagnosed just like you with Asperger's had it been around. And then I was in prison in the short time frame when it was really a thing we used. And now it's just sort of melded into the autism spectrum. But the autism spectrum is right now in this beautiful process of being rethought as fuck your disorder bullshit, right? I don't know who decided that this is ugly or that it's terrible or that you're either normal or you go to special ed and you're separated and pulled out instead of trying to figure out what was going on. But your descriptions of navigating your neuroatypicality really struck a chord with me and helped me realize I'm not the only one that has walked through life with this bizarre childhood, thinking everybody was thinking and going through the same massive cacophony of thoughts that I was experiencing and struggling with understanding social interactions and having a really difficult time not understanding things 100%. My mom told me at like 7 or 8, she came in and I completely disassembled the toilet because I couldn't figure out how it worked. And unless I could really understand how something worked, I just couldn't be okay with it. I could not move on with my day. It stemmed some of the episodes of this podcast that are almost hard to listen to because they're like a lecture about cocaine. And people are like, well, where's your personality? And I just needed somebody to explain cocaine start to finish to me, and I couldn't find it, so I did it. But I wonder if you could say a little bit about your neuroatypicality and how that informed your experience with addiction.
So for me, I just had a lot of sensory issues. So everything was kind of overwhelming all the time. And that led me to compulsive repetitive behaviors, which is kind of the way you do drugs when you don't have drugs. But I was also just very lonely because there's a misconception about autistic people, which is that they don't want to connect. And very much, most of us do want to connect. There may be some who don't. Like, wiring is very, very different for different people. But in my case, I really wanted to connect and I couldn't figure out how to do it. It didn't make sense to me the way reading made sense to me almost immediately. The system, the way that socializing works is just very much less regular and less predictable than, say, music. And especially if you have sensory stuff where all these people can just be overwhelming and the sounds and the lights and everything, so I knew very early I was a very different kind of kid. Unfortunately, I thought most of that meant that I was bad, but I also happened to be very smart. And that's the thing. I think kids interpret the world around them in a specific way, and then that shapes their later development. And it's a terrifying thing for parents. You could say an offhand thing and they could take it and make it the central part of their self. And it's like, there's nothing you can do about that. You just have to be as kind as possible and nobody's going to be perfect. But the way kids are wired is just, I've always been really interested in how these little differences over time can become these huge differences. The right thing at the right time can be huge and the wrong thing at the wrong time similarly. I also think there's certainly people who are more neurotypical than others, but I don't think there actually is a neurotypical. Even people who don't fall on the autism spectrum or don't have any psychiatric or other brain-related issues, they're all very different from each other as well. It's just they're different in a different way that doesn't stand out as much. So
they can perform a little better. They stay in their roles a little more when the rest of us might get distracted or all of a sudden can't turn some part off.
No, that happens often to me with songs getting stuck in my head. But the only thing to do is either sing it or listen to something else. But yeah, understanding also that we are wired differently, so that I might find the idea of, say, going to a parade or being in a big crowd of people horrifying, and I really wouldn't like it, and that would not seem at all fun to me. But some people really love that. I'm not saying they're wrong. It's just a difference in how we perceive what is fun or not, which is good because, thank goodness, some people are fascinated by bugs because otherwise we wouldn't understand insects, which can do tremendous damage. We need to have room for all of the weird fascinations that people can have as long as they're not hurting others. This is what drives me crazy about this particular time. We have this horrible pandemic, and very rapidly we got to vaccines. Think about how amazing that is that our science can do that. And yet we're spending time fighting each other over politics. It just really, really bothers me that we know how to support human flourishing, and we can see the products that happen when this occurs and just the joy that can happen. But then we just do all kinds of stupid shit. When I'm feeling despair or distress, I always try to think about the amazing things that we do have in the world and the very fact that we can talk on this computer like this to each other. And just in getting up or doing anything, you are dealing with the products of thousands of years of multiple cultures to make this be able to happen, and multiple types of cooperation.
I've been thinking a lot about, with this pandemic, not just the addictions that are going to suddenly pop up when we go back to whatever the new normal is, but also people that hadn't realized the depth of, say, social phobias they had that have now self-medicated by just being stuck in their house. But I think a lot of us are going to come back and find ourselves struggling. It's right on time to be having these talks.
It's really important to know that avoidance makes it worse.
Yeah.
Even though avoidance is exactly what you want to do. When you're social phobic, you just want to curl up in the ball and not deal with anything. But if you give in to that too much, you will find getting out of the house becomes enormously, enormously difficult. And right now, we have to balance the risks associated with the pandemic with the risks for those of us who have these issues being too inward. Even for people who are mostly on the typical side of things and who don't have social phobia that's overt, but maybe a little introverted, this can push them over the edge if they don't realize that you have to push through that avoidance sometimes. And I'm saying this especially to myself because I can very much just not want to deal with people. And that actually does not make me happy. And it actually does not make me feel good, but I feel at least like I should be less anxious. I don't even know if it actually makes me less anxious. Anyway, avoidance should be avoided as much as possible. And that said, if you need to lie in your bed sometimes, that's okay too. You just have to find a way to not be too rigid about either of them.
Yeah, I think you just nailed it. It's the talking about it. And that's one of the biggest things with addiction and recovery. This is one of the reasons that 12-step programs work for the people that they work for is the community, the ability to take whatever you're hiding in the closet deep in your heart and it's making you sweat and cry and you're worried, to just spit it out and share it with somebody. And the more we do that with everything else in our life, the better we get. But since we've carved out this spot of addiction that says drugs, sin, drugs, illegal, drugs, bad, well, yeah, it makes sense that we don't even realize that internalized shame.
One of the things that is actually very wonderful about 12 steps is that you go to a meeting, you walk in the door, you see this absolutely gorgeous model who's sharing about how ugly she is. And then you think, wait a minute, maybe my self-hate is equally ridiculous. Or you see this brilliant, famous person talking about how unsuccessful they are. And it's like, oh, okay.
Humans.
Yeah, exactly. And so I, as you know from reading the book, have my issues with forced 12-step. But I think that for all humans, meeting in groups and understanding that we're all people and taking moral inventory and all that kind of stuff is a good thing. The problem for me is if it's only people with addiction that need to do that because we're specifically more bad.
In our country, we're not supposed to see privilege. So as a Christian, just one example, you're supposed to ignore the crosses in the churches and the back of money that says in God we trust and the Pledge of Allegiance and the way that your religious identity is woven through our culture to make you feel at home. There's not necessarily a problem with that. There's a problem with the ignoring of it. Same thing as a white man. I have all these privileges, but it works best if I can be like, what do you mean? I went to prison. I don't have privilege, right? And I think that's the same thing that we're going through, even as we start to update these drug laws.
It's important to realize privileges that we have, but that it doesn't make us bad for being where we are.
Right.
We have to try to do our best to make things better. But sitting around hating yourself for privilege isn't going to help either. It's a fine balance where you have to educate yourself and you have to do your best to understand where things are wrong and where other people are being harmed. I think people often don't want to acknowledge privilege or acknowledge racism because they think that if they do, that means they're admitting they're bad. And you don't want to put people in that spot because then they will just deny. To sort of move forward, you have to think beyond, oh, I'm terrible because this is.
Yeah.
But what can I do so that I can make it so that this is more equivalent and more sustainable and better for
do your
everybody?
part. Right. And this is something we've hit on twice now. When somebody tells you your zipper is undone or you have a booger on your face, instead of saying, oh, Lord, thank you, you get mad at the person and say, how dare you let me know that what I just said might offend somebody or supports racism. But that attitude is systemic. And if we could just get through to people, be compassionate, be empathetic, and recognize that there's a way to think about it like I just did. That instead of saying, how dare you say I'm racist, you're full of shit, to say, oh, if I've inadvertently done something that ties into a system that's 15 times older than I am, so how can I know how the hell all of it works? Thank you for pointing it out. Same thing with trauma. Trauma is something that is pivotal to a lot of addictions, and it was pivotal to mine. But when I looked back on my life, mine was what you might call complex trauma. I don't think that's in the DSM yet, but I had 3 sisters. We all could have experienced the exact same event, and they might not even remember it. They might have experienced it as positive, and it traumatized the hell out of me, right? Now, if I want to talk to my parents about that, suddenly the same monster of how dare you shows up. because they live in a country that is like, if something might be that way, you don't get to tell me because I'll take it personal. If we can start to move together as a culture to move towards, oh, as a parent, you have to be like, I can't help it. I'm going to scratch my cheek wrong. And in 20 years, they're going to be in therapy yelling at me. If you know that's the case, swallow it, accept it, and air it. And the more you talk about it, the more you'll realize, oh, all that shitty feeling and all that, I thought I was just going to feel like crap all day, every day after I admitted there's white privilege in the United States. It works the opposite. And you start to move towards this acceptance. And on that note, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about, you mentioned it earlier, born with it versus you can work on it. This mentality that usually comes from the important people in our lives as to whether or not you think you're born with, say, athletic talent or smarticles, or whether you are just like everybody else, can actually improve as you go.
Yeah, there's really quite interesting research showing that the more you believe that your talents are things that can grow, the better you do. And the more that you believe that it's innate and there's nothing you can do about it, you might start to resort to some of those defensive moves that you were just talking about in relation to other things. Certainly talent exists, and I am never going to be a great football player. But it's also the case that even if you're really crappy at something, if you work hard at it, you can get better at it. And that seeing your ability to change and grow as a skill and a thing that is real allows that to happen. Believing that you're born evil and you're in this fixed place where you will always be bad, well, there's nowhere to go from there. Like, you can just act out badly or hate yourself or whatever. When you realize that you might have these nasty feelings or thoughts or whatever, but if you are acting as well as you can act and being as kind as you can be, you can get better at doing that, because what our brains are good at is what we practice, we become. So if we practice trying to be nicer and trying to not be an asshole, then we can get better at those things. Not that we're not going to fail. And I mean, I think this is why learning again becomes so important. If you're learning any kind of skill, you're going to be lousy at it at first, and you're going to make silly mistakes. And this is the same thing with recovery. You're probably going to make really silly mistakes early in recovery because you don't know how to do it. You can't pound somebody, scream at somebody, and now you're going to play piano. If they don't know how to play, they're still going to sound lousy. The skill has to be developed over time, and that requires practice and error and correcting error, and doing that without being so cruel that you just give up because you're like, oh, I can't do this, it's terrible, and I'm never going to be good at it, and whatever. And my husband made me take dance lessons, and at first I was like, oh God, this is like so embarrassing. I'm really, really, really terrible. Now I'm like vaguely okay. I mean, I can dance to like music without particular steps, but learning like to do specific things physically is not my strong point. I really don't like being the slow one in the class, but I was totally that way. But if you stick with it, you vaguely get better. And I'm not going to say I'm good, but I can certainly say that I'm okay.
We talked through thrill of the hunt, thrill of the feast, and the reason that you can't use, say, methadone maintenance therapy, which works great for opioids, and even to the extent that the myth that people get high every day is bullshit. If you take opioid maintenance therapy, you don't catch a buzz every day. You can go drive your car as long as you follow the rules. We talked briefly about why you can't do this with methamphetamine or with speed, because when you're talking about the thrill of the hunt and what's happening in your brain, it would be much the same as injecting cocaine. You would end up in this sort of tolerance, sensitization, bad spot. But near the end of your book, you talk about the Kiwi experiment and specifically a drug called BCP, which it sounds like they're not selling there anymore. But is that something that you think could be used for maintenance therapy for amphetamine?
That was a very bizarre thing. They tried to have an FDA for recreational drugs, and that is a very good idea, but it is very hard to execute, and they didn't ultimately succeed. I don't think it's good to have people randomly introducing new substances that haven't been tested on humans or even rats, and that's what happened. That stuff does not seem to be particularly bad, but I don't know if it has real therapeutic potential at all. What I do know, though, is that the exception to the hunt and the feast thing with stimulants is people with ADHD can benefit from having a higher level of dopamine. So you may be able to do sort of stimulant maintenance with people with ADHD by just giving them, say, an amphetamine that keeps the dopamine level higher. The experiments that have been done so far trying to do stimulant maintenance have not been as successful as the opioid stuff. And I do think that's a pharmacological issue. But since so many people with addiction are actually self-medicating ADHD, which is probably the most common comorbidity in addiction, it's important to say that stimulant maintenance can work in those cases because you're actually treating an underlying thing. And there are some people, of course, who have ADHD and cannot manage stimulant maintenance because they still escalate.
I believe this was your research too. You mentioned alcohol is very much the same way. Just pharmacologically, the way it works in the brain is that you could not take daily doses and not experience intoxication such that you can't drive. And since alcohol is what's all over our society, people use that to map onto opioid treatment therapy. And if there's somebody that's had a drink every day for 20 days and they notice they still catch a buzz every day, they start to think, well, that's what must be happening. It's not. You're talking different drugs, different people.
Benzodiazepines are another interesting because you could sort of think about, well, should we do like benzo maintenance for alcoholism? But they come with their own set of serious issues, including, in some cases, very, very, very protracted withdrawal. Harm reduction and figuring out pharmacologically what works for an individual is going to be very different from sort of big blanket things you can say. But if I had to choose between getting in a car with somebody who had had 5 scotches, I would pick the person who had that every day as opposed to the person who did it for the first time. But that doesn't mean that the guy that I picked is going to be better than a sober driver. Very much not so. My next book is actually about the history of harm reduction. Harm reduction, I define it as the idea in drug policy that we should stop people from being hurt and not really care about if they're getting high. So if you are getting high and you're not hurting anybody, including yourself, I don't care. But if you are getting HIV or spreading HIV or getting horrible infections or unable to function, then we should as a society care. And what we want to do is reduce overall harm, because if we just focus on a single substance, we end up doing what we just did with painkillers, which is crack down on the medical supply. We cut it dramatically, and we just moved people, either pain patients towards suicide and people with addiction towards fentanyl, which is often suicide. This is not harm reduction. Harm reduction has to look at risks and context. So that drug called kratom or kratom that I never know how to pronounce, which nobody, even the people who take it every day, do not know how to pronounce, that stuff, clearly a less harmful opioid. Would I have chosen to introduce it to the market with no testing? No, I would not. Right. But we have it now, and it has an ancient history in Asia, to be fair. We have it now. To take that away in the context of fentanyls is the stupidest thing ever.
Yep.
You have to focus on the whole context, what people are going to substitute, and how this dynamic system is going to change when you make changes. The thing I also really like about harm reduction is it tends to have an empirical basis. So if something reduces harm, it's harm reduction. If it doesn't, if it's proven to not reduce harm, then it's not harm reduction. So you kind of can't lose with that perspective, which drives the abstinence folks crazy. They're like, well, how can abstinence be harm reduction? Well, if it reduces harm for that particular person, it's harm reduction.
Yeah, most of us eventually figure it out ourselves if we just aren't dead in the meantime. And that's the way I word it to people. It's like, look, I just want people to be alive if and when they ever decide they want to stop using.
Exactly. That's the thing. The core of harm reduction is that all human life is valuable, and then we all have something to give, whether we're using or not, or whatever state we may be in. If we keep people alive so that they can improve however they can improve, that is amazing. And I always think about this when I interview people who are on the street, because you talk to people who are kind and intelligent and they're lovely people, and they're stuck on the street and they're having a very hard time, and we just don't care. And why do we throw that away? Such people could be doing things that would make them feel better, would make everybody else feel better. But no, we just like, they're scummy junkies, go away.
Yep.
And it's just not a way to have a society.
It's never worked.
And one of the things I just always want to say to people in recovery is that you deserve to feel good and have pleasure and have fun in recovery. If your life is not such that that can happen, and let's bracket economic catastrophe for the moment, you should seek help so that you can get to the best mood state you can be for you.
Yep.
And not give up because you think that, oh, well, this is what sobriety is. It's gray and dull and I'm never going to have any fun again. First of all, you're probably not going to stay sober in that situation.
Right.
But if you do, why be miserable if you don't have to be?
So Maia Szalavitz was caught with 2.5 kilograms of cocaine. Is that right?
That is correct.
And this was in New York during the Rockefeller era, right? And I won't spoil how that ended up, but we've sort of hinted on it a little bit in the episode. So again, go buy her book. And also, I've listened to a couple podcasts with you in it, and I don't remember who it was who asked you about cocaine, and somehow Jerry Garcia never came up. So if you want to read a great story about Maia doing cocaine with Jerry Garcia, seriously, buy her book. Well written from start to finish. And do you have a name for the new book?
Yes, so the new book is called Undoing Drugs. And I cannot yet remember the subtitle, which I'm going to have to fix because we've gone through a few of them. But the main title is Undoing Drugs, and it's a history of harm reduction, and it's coming out in late July.
Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to sit down with me.
Cool.
That was Maia Szalavitz. You can find her book, Unbroken Brain, on Amazon or wherever you buy books. Her new book, Undoing Drugs, can already be pre-ordered through a few online suppliers, and it'll be released in July. A few summary points to chew on. There's no such thing as an addictive personality or a genetic trait that guarantees someone will suffer from addiction. You heard us talk about this today as well. But there are personalities and genetic markers that make it pretty certain in certain circumstances. But it always requires that last part, certain circumstances. Addiction is nature and nurture, and it most often unfolds in the margins, in people who are either very happy or very sad. People who are very anxious or very relaxed. The majority of any population is likely to have an easy go at some things because they'll find plenty of others just like them to reinforce their worldview, to make them feel normal and accepted. So whether it's anxiety, depression, religiosity, or measures of intelligence, those who fall outside the so-called norm are likely to feel out of place more often than those who find themselves surrounded by others who appear to be just like them. And when we feel out of place, we find ourselves turning to remedies, like drugs. Thanks to Maia for dropping in for the great chat. The pathway out of our current overdose crisis runs directly through the learning disorder model, and along the way, we'll find ourselves throwing out the tools that we currently use to shame drug users in our culture. Prison, forced rehab, disease models, anti-drug laws, public service announcements. We have to rethink all of them. So let's get to work. Love yourselves and the addicted people in your life. I'm your host, Ben Boyce. The After Episode Detox. I really appreciate you sitting down. You have the best book I've read about addiction. So I strongly encourage all of my listeners, if you're looking for a way to rethink addiction or to understand what's going on with the loved ones in your life who are struggling at times with addiction, read this book and then read it again. Let it soak in. I felt like I was reading a book from a kindred spirit, but I'm at this point now in my career where I'm doing a little bit of what you made me feel like with this book, giving people that are going through it right now a narrative, much like happens in 12-step programs, where you can look at somebody and say, oh, that is what somebody that's been through addiction or that's struggling with addiction can be. So from one to another, thank you for the work you've done there.
Oh, thanks so much. It's always good to hear from people who have gone to Eastville and enjoyed it and all of that kind of stuff. You know, this is what warms every writer's heart, basically.